After that call, something in him began to shift. He realized this wasn't just about his loss. It was about something bigger. It was about fairness, respect, and the way people sometimes forget what service really means. A week later, a major news outlet invited him to share his story. He hesitated at first, but then agreed, not for attention, but because he wanted to set the record straight. The interview was filmed at his home. He sat on the porch wearing a simple shirt, his hands resting on his knees. The interviewer asked calm, respectful questions, not about his past missions, but about his life, his dog, and how he felt. When he spoke, his words were simple, steady, and honest. "I served this country for many years," he said quietly. "I've seen loss. I've seen fear. I know what real danger looks like. My dog wasn't danger. He was family. He was peace for me. And when they took him, they didn't just take a pet. They took a part of that peace." The room fell silent when the interview aired. People all over the country watched. The comments flooded in, not just sympathy but deep respect. His calmness, his refusal to speak with hate, moved people. Within days, the local authorities announced that they would reopen the case. The department placed the officers involved on leave, while an internal investigation took place. For the first time, there was a sense that accountability might follow, but the man didn't celebrate. He didn't want revenge, he just wanted understanding. He started spending his afternoons volunteering at a local shelter, helping with the dogs. Being around them gave him peace. He would kneel beside the kennels, speaking softly to each one. Some were scared, some were lonely, but his voice always calmed them. The staff soon realized he had a way with animals, quiet but powerful. One evening, the shelter director approached him. "You know," she said, "you could help a lot of people if you shared what you've learned and about patience, discipline, love, especially with other veterans who are struggling." He thought about it. The idea stayed in his mind. A few weeks later, he started a small project. Nothing official at first, just a simple idea. He began helping veterans pair with rescue dogs, teaching them how to train and bond with them. He called the project Shadows Watch. Word spread quickly. Soon, other shelters and veterans groups wanted to be part of it. What started as a personal effort turned into something meaningful for many. Men and women who had seen war began finding peace again, one dog at a time. When the news came that the investigation had concluded, confirming that his dog's death had been unjustified, the world expected him to speak out angrily. Instead, he released a short statement. "Justice isn't revenge, it's understanding. I hope this helps others be more careful, more human." That was all he said. The community respected him even more after that. People began to see him not just as a victim, but as a symbol of quiet strength, someone who turned pain into purpose. On a quiet afternoon months later, he visited the small field where Shadow used to play. The grass was tall, the sky bright. He carried a small wooden plaque with Shadow's name on it and placed it under a tree. He stood there for a while, the wind moving softly around him. "You did good, boy," he whispered. "You're still watching." As he walked away, there was peace in his steps. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from accepting and continuing forward. And though he had once been known for his strength in battle, it was his calm, his compassion, and his refusal to let bitterness win that made people remember him most. Months passed quietly. The leaves that had once turned gold in the fall were gone now, replaced by the cool wind of early spring. The small town had returned to its normal rhythm, but for the man, nothing was quite the same. He moved through his days differently, slower, more deliberate, yet more at peace than before. The project he had started, Shadows Watch, began to grow faster than he ever expected. What began as one man helping a few veterans had turned into a nationwide network. Shelters and veteran organizations started reaching out from other states, asking for guidance on how to start their own branches. He never wanted fame, but people respected his calm leadership. When he spoke, others listened, not because of fancy words, but because his tone carried experience. He didn't try to be a hero. He just wanted to give back something that made life worth living again. Every morning, he would visit the training ground he had built behind his small house. It wasn't much, just a fenced area, a few benches, and a patch of open dirt where dogs could run. Some mornings the air would be filled with the sound of barking and laughter as veterans trained their new companions. He would stand near the gate, watching them with quiet pride. Sometimes when a new member joined, nervous or unsure, he'd walk over and gently say, "Take your time. The dog doesn't care about what you've been through. He just cares about who you are right now." That simple line often broke through the walls people carried. They would relax, smile, and start again. His story had inspired many, but he rarely mentioned the past, the night that started it all. He didn't want the story of loss to overshadow the story of growth. To him, Shadow's memory lived not in sorrow, but in every tail wag, every soft bark, every veteran who smiled again. Still, sometimes late at night when the house was silent, he would walk to the small wooden plaque under the tree, Shadow's resting place. He would sit there quietly, thinking of the years gone by, the battles fought, and the peace he had finally found. One evening as he sat there, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning slightly, he saw a familiar face, the same journalist who had first tried to talk to him months ago. She smiled warmly and said, "I didn't want to disturb you. I just came to see how things have been going." He nodded for her to sit. She took a seat beside him on the grass, notebook in hand but closed, as if she didn't want to write. "Only listen. I've been following your project," she said softly. "It's helping so many people. Did you ever imagine it would grow like this?" He gave a faint smile. "No, I just wanted to help one person, maybe give them what I lost." But it turns out a lot of people were looking for the same thing. They sat in silence for a moment, the evening air filled with the sound of crickets. The journalist hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think about that night? About what happened?" He looked at the ground for a long time before replying. "Sometimes, but not with anger anymore. I used to replay it in my head, trying to understand why it had to happen. Now I realize some things happen to push us towards something bigger. I can't change the past, but I can build something good from it." The journalist smiled and said quietly, "You already have." She eventually stood, thanked him for his time, and left. But after she walked away, he stayed under that tree a little longer, watching the sky darken. He felt calm, not because everything was perfect, but because he finally understood his place in the world again. The next few months brought more change. Local schools invited him to speak about resilience and kindness. Community centers asked him to share his story with younger people. At first he was hesitant. Public speaking had never been his thing. But after one visit, when a teenager came up and said, "You made me want to be better," he realized his story wasn't just about loss. It was about teaching others how to heal. Each talk was simple. He never used big speeches or dramatic words. He told real stories, about service, about loyalty, about how strength wasn't just about muscles or medals, but about staying kind even when life was unfair. People listened. They saw someone who had lived through pain, but refused to let it turn him bitter. One day he received a letter from one of the police officers who had been involved that night. It wasn't long, but it was sincere. The officer wrote that he had left the force and wanted to personally apologize for what happened. He wrote about the guilt he carried, the nights he couldn't sleep, and how he had joined a program to help train officers in handling situations more calmly. The man read the letter carefully, then placed it in a drawer beside Shadow's collar. He didn't reply immediately. It took him weeks to find the right words, but eventually he wrote back. His letter was short, only a few lines. "I forgive you, not because what happened was okay, but because carrying anger doesn't build anything. I hope you do good with what you've learned." After mailing it, he sat outside feeling lighter than he had in years. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it freed him from it. As the years went by, Shadow's watch grew into a recognized foundation. He traveled occasionally to speak at events, but he always came back home to his quiet town. The place where it all began remained special to him. He kept his daily routine, early morning walks, time at the shelter, training sessions with new veterans and their dogs. Some days when the sun set low over the horizon, he would stand in the yard and imagine Shadow running through the field again, full of life and joy. People often asked him how he managed to stay so calm after everything. His answer was always simple. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you build one day at a time. And that was how he lived, building peace slowly, patiently. One quiet afternoon, He stood in front of a group of young recruits at a local training center. They had invited him to speak about leadership and courage. Standing there in his simple jacket, he looked at them, faces full of energy and uncertainty. He told them stories, not of war, but of what came after, of learning patience, of understanding that strength doesn't come from fighting, but from knowing when not to. When he finished, the room was silent. One young man raised his hand and asked, "Sir, if you could go back and change anything, would you?" He thought about it for a long moment. Then he smiled softly and said, "I'd wish Shadow never got hurt, but if that pain hadn't happened, maybe none of this would exist. Sometimes what breaks us also builds us, just not the way we expect." There was a quiet nodding in the crowd. Everyone seemed to understand something deeper that didn't need more words. After the talk, he walked outside, the sun warm on his face. A small puppy from the center ran up to him, tail wagging. He bent down and gently patted its head, feeling that familiar warmth, that quiet reminder of why he did everything he did. Later that night, he sat on his porch, sipping tea and looking at the stars. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. There was no more noise, no more anger, no more searching for answers that didn't exist. There was just peace, earned, steady, real. The world still remembered him, not for the tragedy that started it all, but for the grace that followed. He glanced at the wooden plaque under the tree and smiled softly. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "You're still watching over them." And in that moment, surrounded by quiet, he felt something deeper than pride, a kind of gentle peace that comes only after long storms. A peace that feels like coming home. The night after the incident was long and heavy. The man sat in his chair, staring at the empty corner of the room where his dog used to sleep. The collar still hung on the wall, the leash still near the door, but the house felt lifeless now. He hadn't eaten, hadn't moved much since the officers left. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened, but for him, time had stopped. When morning came, sunlight crept through the curtains, brushing across the wooden floor. He hadn't slept at all. His coffee sat untouched on the table, now cold. He got up slowly, walked outside, and looked toward the small patch of ground near the tree where he had laid his dog to rest. It was quiet. The air smelled of wet grass, and every breath felt heavier than the last. He stood there for a long while, thinking about the years they had spent together, how that dog had once followed him through rough terrain during training, how it had learned to stay calm under pressure, how it seemed to understand him in ways no one else ever could. The memories flooded his mind, each one like a small cut to his heart. As the hours passed, he began to notice things around the yard, a few bullet marks on the gate, some trampled flowers near the porch, and the faint echo of what had happened. He tried to steady his breathing. Years of discipline kept him from losing control, but inside, he was a storm. Later that morning, the local police chief arrived at his door. The man opened it silently. The chief looked nervous, his voice low and cautious. "Sir, I just wanted to come by personally and apologize for what happened. It was a terrible mistake. The officers involved will be placed under review." The man didn't respond right away. He just stared, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he said quietly, "A mistake? My dog was my family. You can't review that." The chief sighed, unable to find the right words. He offered to file an official report, to begin an internal investigation, to make sure such a thing never happened again. The man listened, but deep down, he knew words couldn't fix what was already gone. When the chief left, the man went inside and opened an old wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were military patches, a folded flag, and a small metal tag engraved with a code number, his identification from his Delta Force days. For the first time in years, he held it in his hand again. The metal felt cold, just like his mood. He sat on the floor with the box beside him, remembering the people he had lost before. Soldiers, friends, brothers. In combat, every loss came with a purpose, a reason, but this loss had none. It came from fear, from carelessness, from the world's failure to see beyond stereotypes. By evening, he decided to drive into town. He needed to clear his head. As he walked into the small grocery store, people noticed him right away. They had seen the flashing lights the day before and had heard whispers. One of the neighbors, a kind older woman, approached him gently and said, "I'm so sorry for what happened. We all know how much that dog meant to you." He nodded softly, forcing a small smile, but didn't say much. He picked up a few things, water, bread, some canned food, and left quietly. People watched him as he walked out, not out of judgment, but with quiet sympathy. When he returned home, there were tire marks on the road where the police had been parked. He looked at them for a moment, then walked to the porch. The sound of the crickets filled the air, but even nature's calm couldn't silence what echoed in his mind. That single sound that changed everything. That night, he sat outside under the stars, thinking about what to do next. He wasn't a man who believed in revenge. His years of service had taught him that revenge never fixed anything. It only built more pain. But justice, he believed in that. He believed in accountability and truth. He pulled out an old notebook and started writing. He wrote down everything that had happened. Every word, every action, every small detail. He wrote not out of anger, but clarity. His handwriting was slow and steady, like a soldier making a report. In the days that followed, the story began to spread quietly around town. A few neighbors posted about it online, about how a retired veteran's dog had been shot by mistake. People were angry, others were confused. The local paper called him for a comment, but he refused to speak publicly. He didn't want attention. He wanted understanding. Then one afternoon, a reporter from the city showed up at his door. She said she wanted to share his story, to tell the world what really happened. At first, he said no. He didn't want pity or fame, but she explained that sometimes the truth helps others prevent the same mistake. After a long pause, he agreed to talk. They sat on his porch. The reporter's camera stayed off. She just listened. He told her about his dog, how he'd rescued it overseas, how it had been trained with discipline and care, how it was never violent. He described the morning of the shooting, his voice calm but heavy. The reporter barely interrupted, only nodding as he spoke. When she left, she promised to share his story with respect. He didn't think much of it, but within days his story reached thousands, then millions. People across the country began to talk about him, not because of his background, but because of how he carried himself. They learned that he wasn't just an ordinary man. He had been one of the most skilled Delta Force leaders, a man who had protected others under the harshest conditions. And now, the same person who once fought to keep people safe had been failed by those sworn to protect. Messages started pouring in. Veterans reached out, offering their support. Some came to visit, standing quietly by his dog's resting place, saluting before leaving. They didn't need words. They understood what that loss meant. Meanwhile, within the police department, tension grew. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave. They gave their statements explaining they felt threatened, that they acted out of instinct. But their superiors began to uncover the truth. The situation hadn't been dangerous, and their decision had been rushed. The man didn't celebrate their punishment. He didn't wish harm on anyone. What he wanted was acknowledgement, for someone to admit that fear had taken control instead of reason. One morning he received a letter from the police chief, formally apologizing again. Along with it came an offer he was to meet privately and talk. At first he didn't respond, but after thinking about it for days, he agreed. They met in a quiet office at the station. The chief looked tired, older somehow. "I know we can't undo what happened," he said softly, "but I want to make this right." The man looked at him, eyes calm but steady. "Making it right," he said, "doesn't mean fixing it for me. It means making sure no one else goes through this." The chief nodded slowly. "I understand." They talked for a long time, about fear, about judgment, about the need for better training. The man shared stories from his years in service, how discipline meant waiting, observing, thinking before acting. He told them that in battle, 1 second of panic could destroy lives, and that the same rule applied on the streets. When he left the station, something inside him felt lighter. Not healed, but steadier. He wasn't fighting against the system. He was trying to teach it. Days turned into weeks. His story continued to travel far beyond what he expected. News outlets covered it with care. Veterans organizations invited him to speak, and strangers sent letters of support. Some wrote about their own dogs, their own losses, their own moments of unfairness. It became more than his story. It became a reminder of how easily fear can blind judgment. At home, the man began to rebuild his routine. He still woke up early, still made coffee, still walked the same path in the yard where his dog once ran. Sometimes he'd stop near the grave and talk softly, as if his friend were still listening. He promised he would carry on, not with anger, but with purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he sat on the porch again. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, he thought he could almost hear the soft sound of paws on the ground. He smiled faintly. Maybe it was just memory, or maybe some bonds never truly fade. He picked up his notebook again and continued writing. Not just about loss now, but about what he had learned. He wrote about forgiveness, about patience, about the importance of restraint. He wanted his words to reach those who wore a uniform, not to shame them, but to remind them that every decision, every moment, could change someone's world. The night grew darker, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The ache remained, but it no longer consumed him. He had turned his pain into something that mattered. A voice, a message, a lesson that would live beyond him. And though his house was quiet, there was peace again. Not the same kind as before, but the kind that comes when a man knows he has turned heartbreak into meaning. The next few weeks moved slowly, like time had chosen to walk instead of run. The man kept to himself, spending most of his days in silence. Sometimes he would sit outside with a notebook, writing thoughts that he never planned to share. Other days he just walked aimlessly through the fields behind his home. The dog's absence followed him like a quiet shadow, but something had changed inside him. He was no longer only grieving. He was watching, thinking, and seeing things in ways he hadn't before. The world felt louder, more impatient. Every time he turned on the news, there was another story about confusion, fear, and mistakes that led to loss. It reminded him of how easily people forgot what discipline and calm could do. One morning, he received a letter from a nearby university. A professor who had read his story invited him to speak to a group of students studying criminal justice and leadership. The man hesitated at first. He wasn't someone who liked attention. He didn't want to stand in front of cameras or crowds. But the letter's tone was sincere. It wasn't about publicity, it was about learning. After some thought, he agreed. The day he went to the university, he wore a simple shirt and jeans. No uniform, no medals, nothing to remind anyone who he had once been. When he entered the small auditorium, the room fell quiet. The students had seen his story online. Some had even written essays about it. He started speaking softly. His voice was calm but deep, the kind that held experience behind every word. He didn't tell them about his military missions or awards. He told them about patience, about breathing before reacting, about what fear can do when it's not controlled. He said, "You can train for years, you can study everything there is to know. But if you let fear decide for you, you'll make the wrong choice." The students listened closely. There was something powerful about his simplicity. He didn't raise his voice, yet every person in the room could feel the weight of what he meant. He ended his talk by saying, "Discipline isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself." When he finished, the room filled with quiet applause. The professor thanked him deeply. Some students stayed behind to speak to him personally, asking how he managed to stay calm after losing so much. He told them that anger never builds peace, but it only makes wounds deeper. After that day, invitations began to come more often. Schools, police training academies, even community centers wanted him to talk. His words were spreading quietly, not through fame, but through respect. He didn't see himself as a teacher. He just shared what life had already taught him the hard way. Still, the nights were hard. Every time he looked at the empty space by the door, he felt that ache again. Sometimes, he would wake up expecting to hear the sound of paws on the floor. The silence always hit harder after that. He missed the simple joy of companionship, the feeling of coming home to someone waiting for him. One afternoon, while sitting on his porch, a car pulled up to his driveway. It was the police chief again. This time, he wasn't there with papers or apologies. He came alone, holding something in his hands, a small framed picture. The chief said quietly, "We found this in the officer's file. It was taken that day. I thought you might want it." The man took the frame and looked at it. The photo showed his yard in the distance, the last moment before the world had shifted. He stared at it for a while and then placed it on the table beside him. The chief hesitated before saying, "We've started new training sessions. We've used your story as part of it. We're trying to do better." The man looked at him, his expression calm. Then maybe something good can come out of this, he said softly. The chief nodded, thanked him again, and left. When the car disappeared down the road, the man looked up at the sky. The sun was dipping low, coloring the fields gold. He whispered quietly, "Maybe this is what you wanted, my friend, for the world to learn something from your loyalty." In the following weeks, he noticed more visitors stopping by. Some were veterans who had read his story and wanted to shake his hand. Others were people who had lost pets who said his calmness helped them heal. He listened to all of them, never turning anyone away. One visitor stood out. It was a young police recruit, barely in his 20s. He said he wanted to thank the man personally for teaching him something before his training even began. "I watched your interview," the recruit said quietly. "It changed how I see things. It made me realize that protecting people means understanding them, not fearing them." The man smiled faintly. "Then you'll do well," he said. That conversation stayed with him for days. He realized that sometimes one story, even one filled with pain, could reach people in ways no lecture or manual ever could. He started to spend time volunteering at a local animal rescue center. The first few days were difficult. Seeing dogs again stirred memories he wasn't sure he was ready for, but slowly being around them brought back a kind of peace he had missed. He helped train them, using the same gentle patience he once used with his own dog. The staff admired how calm and precise he was. Every movement deliberate, every word kind. One of the volunteers, an older man, told him one evening, "You've got a gift. Dogs trust you almost immediately," he smiled. "They just need someone who listens. Most of them aren't angry. They're just scared." He didn't realize how much that sentence described himself too. As the months passed, life began to settle again, though never quite the same. He had built a quiet rhythm, mornings spent walking, afternoons volunteering, evenings writing or speaking at local events. The town saw him as a man who had turned pain into purpose. People started calling him when they needed advice about discipline or calm in hard situations. Then, one day, he received a letter from Washington, D.C. It was from an organization that supported veterans transitioning into civilian life. They had heard about his story and wanted to honor him at a small ceremony. He thought about refusing. He didn't like the idea of standing under lights being recognized for something that came from tragedy. But he also knew the message was bigger than him now. He accepted. When the day arrived, he stood before a crowd of veterans, officers, and families. The host spoke about his years of service, his leadership, and how his recent story had inspired changes in police training across several states. But when it was his turn to speak, he didn't talk about the awards or the ceremony. He talked about his dog. He said, "That dog wasn't just an animal to me. He was a symbol of loyalty and peace. Losing him showed me that even in a safe place, fear can destroy what we love. But it also taught me that forgiveness is stronger than anger, and that teaching is more powerful than punishment." The audience was silent, completely still. When he finished, they stood and clapped, not out of sympathy, but out of respect. After the event, an older veteran approached him and said, "You remind me that the fight doesn't always end when we come home. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the quiet ones." That night, when he returned home, he placed the small medal he received next to the old collar that still hung by the door. The two symbols, one of service, one of loyalty, seemed to belong together. He sat by the window looking out into the night sky. The stars were bright, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of calm. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned to live with it. Before going to bed, he walked to the small resting place under the tree. He knelt down and said softly, "We did something good, didn't we?" The wind moved gently through the leaves, almost like an answer. He smiled faintly, stood up, and walked back to the house. He turned off the lights, and for the first time since that terrible day, the silence didn't hurt. It felt peaceful, like the quiet he had always wanted was finally real again. Months passed, and life in the small town slowly found its quiet rhythm again. The man had learned to live with the emptiness that lingered in his home. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled his days. It had become a silent companion, one that reminded him of what mattered, of what was lost, and of what could still be made right. His talks and visits continued. Wherever he went, people listened closely. His story wasn't told with anger or loud words. It was told with calmness and honesty, and that made it more powerful. He didn't speak about himself as a victim. He spoke about lessons and about patience, responsibility, and the value of understanding before reacting. He often said, "Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the choice to stay kind when life gives you every reason not to be." Those words stayed with people. Soon he started receiving letters from families he'd never met. Some wrote to thank him for reminding them that forgiveness was possible. Others said his story helped them see officers and citizens as human beings again, both capable of fear and both capable of compassion. One morning, while drinking his coffee on the porch, he received a phone call from a producer who worked for a national TV network. She wanted to invite him to share his experience in a televised interview. The man hesitated. He didn't like the idea of cameras and lights, but the producer explained that millions could learn something from his calmness, that his message could inspire change on a larger scale. After a long pause, he agreed. A week later, he traveled to the city. It had been a long time since he'd left his quiet surroundings. The noise, the traffic, and the crowds felt unfamiliar. Yet as he sat in the studio, he carried that same steady composure that once defined him on the battlefield. When the cameras started rolling, the interviewer asked him gently, "After everything that happened, how did you manage to stay so calm?" He looked down for a moment, then raised his eyes. "Because anger doesn't heal anything," he said simply. "When you've seen real loss, you learn that shouting doesn't bring peace. You listen, you breathe, and you choose what kind of person you want to be afterward." The interviewer nodded, clearly moved. He continued, "The men who made that mistake, I don't hate them. I want them to learn. Because if they learn, then no one else will lose what I lost." That clip would later be shared across the country. People from all walks of life commented, saying his words changed how they saw conflict. Police departments began discussing emotional training, communication skills, and empathy as part of their programs. What started as tragedy was slowly becoming transformation. After returning home, the man found a small package waiting for him. It was from a child who had seen his story on TV. Inside was a simple drawing, a man standing beside a dog under a big tree. On the bottom were the words, "Thank you for being brave." He placed the drawing on the wall next to the old collar. Every time he walked past it, he felt something warm inside, a reminder that even small gestures could carry deep meaning. As winter approached, the town grew quieter. The trees lost their leaves and frost began to settle on the grass. He spent more time indoors writing in his notebook. Some nights he wrote about the past, but most nights he wrote about what he wanted the future to look like. A world where people acted with thought instead of fear, where strength meant patience, not power. One evening, there was a knock on his door. It was the same young recruit who had visited him months ago. The young man looked nervous but determined. "I just wanted to thank you again," he said. "I graduated from the academy last week. I used your story as my final essay and about judgment and restraint." The man smiled. "And what did you learn?" The recruit replied softly, "That courage isn't pulling the trigger, it's knowing when not to." The man nodded. "Then you'll make a fine officer." They talked for a while about the world, about duty, about how easy it is for fear to disguise itself as strength. Before leaving, the young man handed him a small metal pin shaped like a shield. "For you," he said. "It's a reminder that your story didn't end in pain. It began something new." After he left, the man placed the pin beside the dog's collar. The sight of them together, one from his past, one from the future, made him realize that his message was truly living on through others. Days turned into weeks again. Snow fell softly across the fields, covering everything in white. On Christmas morning, he woke to find a letter slid under his door. It was from one of the officers involved in the shooting. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. The letter began, "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I think about that day every single night. I made a mistake because I was scared. You had every right to hate me, but instead you showed more grace than I deserved. I've learned more from your silence than from anything in my training. Thank you for not turning your pain into more pain." The man read the letter twice. He didn't cry, but his eyes softened. He folded it carefully and placed it in his notebook. He didn't need to write back. The letter itself was enough. It showed that change was happening even quietly. As the snow continued to fall, he stood at the window watching the flakes drift down. He whispered softly, "That's all I wanted, for someone to understand. When spring came, the town invited him to a small ceremony at the local park. They wanted to dedicate a new area for veterans and service animals, a place for remembrance and peace. At first, he didn't plan to go, but when he heard they had planted a tree in honor of his dog, he changed his mind. On the day of the ceremony, the sun was warm, and a soft breeze moved through the park. People gathered quietly, some with small flags, others just standing with their hands folded. The mayor spoke briefly about courage, service, and forgiveness. Then she invited the man to say a few words. He stepped up to the small podium, looked at the crowd, and began in his calm, steady voice. This tree will grow strong because it was planted with care. That's how peace works too. It grows when people care enough to learn. My dog taught me patience. Losing him taught me purpose. And now seeing all of you here, I see that purpose living on. When he finished, the crowd stood in silence, not because they didn't know how to respond, but because his words didn't need noise. They carried their own weight. A few people wiped their eyes quietly. After the ceremony, he walked over to the young tree. Its leaves shimmered gently in the sunlight. He placed his hand on its small trunk and said softly, "You'll do just fine." That night, as he sat on his porch watching the sky fade into twilight, he realized something had changed inside him for good. The grief was still there, but it was no longer heavy. It had turned into something useful, something that gave meaning to every new day. He thought about how strange life could be. A single event, one mistake, had broken his peace, but in the end, it had created a ripple of understanding that reached far beyond his small town. He never sought fame or attention, yet his story had traveled farther than he ever imagined. He whispered into the night, "You didn't leave me, my friend. You just changed the way you stay." The wind moved through the trees again, soft and steady as if answering him. Before going inside, he looked once more at the open fields, the stars above, and the little path that led to the resting place under the tree. He felt no anger, no sadness, and only gratitude. Gratitude that even through loss he had found something bigger than himself. As he closed the door behind him, he knew that the world would keep moving, and so would he. He had chosen peace, and in doing so, he had become something stronger than the pain that once tried to break him. Years passed quietly, like pages turning in a book he no longer needed to read aloud. The man had grown older, but his spirit carried the same calm strength that once defined him. The lines on his face spoke of stories untold, not of battlefields or loss, but of endurance, patience, and a heart that refused to harden even after being tested by life in the harshest ways. Every morning, he took the same walk down the path behind his house. It led to the small field where the tree stood, the one planted in memory of his loyal companion. The tree had grown tall now, its branches stretching wide, offering shade to anyone who passed by. Sometimes children played near it, unaware of its meaning, but that didn't matter to him. The tree had become part of the town's rhythm, strong, quiet, and full of life. On certain days, he would bring his coffee and sit beneath it. He'd listen to the sounds of the wind, the distant hum of cars, and the occasional bark of dogs in nearby yards. It was peaceful, in the kind of way that made you forget the noise of the world for a while. People still visited him sometimes. New recruits, officers, even strangers who had read or heard about his story. They came not because he was famous, but because his calmness felt like something rare. They said talking to him made them think differently about anger, duty, and forgiveness. One afternoon, a woman knocked on his door. She introduced herself as a journalist working on a piece about community healing and leadership. She had heard about his story years ago and wanted to meet him in person. He welcomed her in, offered her tea, and listened more than he spoke. When she finally asked how he managed to find peace after so much loss, he smiled gently and said, "I stopped asking why things happen and started asking what I can learn from them." She looked down, thinking. "Most people would have let anger define them," she said softly. He nodded. "Anger is heavy. Carry it long enough and it becomes your home. I chose to move out." She smiled at his words, knowing they'd stay with her long after she left. As the months went by, the man began to notice that his days had become quieter than before. He didn't mind the silence. In fact, he had grown to love it. But there were moments when memories came to him unexpectedly. Sometimes, while cleaning his porch, he'd hear a faint echo, a bark that wasn't there but felt real enough to make him turn his head. It was as if the past still whispered, reminding him of everything that shaped him into who he was. One evening, as the sun was setting, he sat at his table writing in his old notebook, the same one he'd filled over the years with thoughts, reflections, and letters he never sent. On the last page, he wrote, "The greatest victory isn't winning a war or proving you're right. It's being able to face your pain,